Imagine seeing an old Volkswagen Transporter T3 on the highway in the 1980s and assuming it was carrying tools, spare parts, or a group of workers. Now imagine that the same van suddenly pulls away from you at a speed that most sports cars of the era would respect. Underneath the rear of that ordinary-looking Volkswagen was not a diesel or a modest four-cylinder engine, but a 3.2-liter flat-six from the Porsche 911 Carrera. This was the Porsche B32, one of the strangest and rarest vehicles ever to leave the Porsche workshop. And the reason it existed was almost ridiculous. Porsche needed a van that could actually keep up. In the early 1980s, Porsche engineers were involved in increasingly demanding testing programs and motorsport projects, including work surrounding the legendary 959. The problem was simple: a normal Volkswagen Transporter was useful, practical, and spacious, but it was painfully slow compared with the cars it was supposed to support. Engineers did what engineers at Porsche often do when something doesn't work. They stopped asking whether the solution made sense and started asking how far they could take it. The idea was simple. Take a Volkswagen T3 Transporter and put a Porsche 911 engine in it. The result became known as the B32. At first glance, the concept sounded almost like a joke. A rear-engine Volkswagen van with the heart of a 911? But Porsche did not treat the project like a joke. The company fitted the van with the 3.2-liter horizontally opposed six-cylinder engine from the 911 Carrera, producing around 231 horsepower in its European specification. That might not sound extraordinary by modern standards, but in the early 1980s it was an enormous amount of power for a van. The standard T3 was never designed to move with the urgency of a sports car. Porsche completely changed that. The engine was paired with a Porsche transmission sending power to the rear wheels, and the suspension was upgraded to handle the additional performance. The brakes were also strengthened because there was no point making the van fast if it could not stop. Porsche even made changes to the body to help deal with the heat generated by the flat-six. Additional air intakes were added, particularly around the rear of the vehicle, allowing more cooling air to reach the engine. The visual changes remained subtle. That was part of the charm. The B32 could still look like a normal T3 from a distance. But close inspection revealed Porsche Fuchs wheels, revised bumpers, additional cooling openings, a larger exhaust, and other details that separated it from a normal Volkswagen. Inside, the transformation continued. Some B32 examples received leather upholstery, additional gauges, and a Porsche steering wheel carrying the famous crest. The van could accommodate passengers and luggage like a normal transporter, but everything behind the driver was powered by the same basic philosophy that created the 911. It was practical transportation hiding a serious performance machine. And then came the numbers. Depending on the source and specification, the B32 was capable of around 185 km per hour, with some period or secondary sources citing higher figures. More importantly, it could accelerate to 100 km per hour in roughly 10 seconds. That may sound slow next to modern Porsches, but in its era the comparison was completely different. You were looking at a boxy van with a huge windshield, upright bodywork, and enough room for a small group of people, yet it could move like a sports sedan. And that was exactly the point. Porsche was not trying to build the fastest van in the world. It was trying to build a support vehicle that would not get left behind by the machines it was supporting. That practical reason is what makes the B32 so fascinating. It was not born from a marketing department. It was born from a problem inside Porsche. The company needed speed in a vehicle that was normally associated with utility. And once Porsche engineers realized that a 911 engine could fit into the T3, the project became much more interesting. The B32 was assembled at Porsche's workshop in Welcherath near the Nürburgring rather than coming off an ordinary Volkswagen production line. That alone tells you how unusual the vehicle was. This was not simply a Volkswagen with an aftermarket engine swap performed by someone in a garage. Porsche itself was responsible for the conversion, and surviving examples are recognized as some of the rarest Porsche-related vehicles of the period. The exact production figure is still debated, with different sources citing numbers such as 7, 9, 10, or slightly more when prototypes are included. What is certain is that production was extremely limited, with only a tiny number of genuine factory-built B32s known to exist. That makes the van far rarer than many famous Porsche models. And rarity is only part of the story. The B32 also represented something unusual about Porsche itself. Porsche has always been associated with sports cars, but the company's history is full of unconventional engineering decisions. The 911 was rear-engined. The 928 was a front-engine V8 Grand Tourer. The Cayenne later transformed the company's business. But the B32 was different. It took one of the least athletic vehicles imaginable and injected it with the mechanical DNA of a 911. It was almost as if Porsche had decided that no vehicle was allowed to be boring if the engineers had enough time. The contrast was enormous. The T3 was designed for families, businesses, camping, deliveries, and practical transportation. The 911 was designed to go fast. The B32 combined those two worlds. You could carry people. You could carry equipment. You could use it as a support vehicle. And yet, when the road opened up, the same van could suddenly start behaving like a Porsche. Imagine what that must have looked like in the 1980s. A normal-looking Volkswagen sitting at a traffic light next to a sports coupe. The light changes. The Porsche-powered van pulls away. The driver of the sports car has no idea what just happened. That sleeper quality became one of the B32's defining characteristics. It was never designed to attract attention. In fact, the more ordinary it looked, the better it worked. The truly impressive engineering was hidden beneath a practical body. Porsche also had to deal with a major technical challenge: heat. The T3's rear engine layout was never intended for a high-performance air-cooled flat-six producing the power of a 911 Carrera. Flat-six responds. Rear wheels turn. Van moves very quickly. And that simplicity makes the B32 feel almost rebellious. The vehicle was never supposed to be exciting. It was supposed to be useful. Yet Porsche transformed usefulness into performance. The B32 also raises an interesting question: why did Porsche never put it into serious mass production? The answer is probably as simple as the cars themselves were complicated. Building a transporter with a 911 drivetrain was expensive. The modifications were extensive. The customer base would have been tiny. And from a business perspective, there was little reason to create a high-volume Porsche van decades before the Cayenne proved that Porsche could successfully sell vehicles outside its traditional sports car identity. In the 1980s, a six-cylinder Porsche van would have been an extremely strange product. The cost would have been high, maintenance would have been unusual, and the market would have been difficult to define. So the B32 remained extremely limited. And that decision probably made it even more desirable in the long run. Because if Porsche had built thousands of them, the B32 might simply be remembered as an odd chapter in the company's history. Instead, it became a unicorn. A vehicle that almost nobody could own. A Porsche that looked like a Volkswagen. A van that could sound like a 911. A support vehicle that eventually became a collector's treasure. The B32 is also a reminder that Porsche's engineering culture has always had a certain willingness to experiment. The company's most famous cars are often remembered for their precise specifications, but some of the most entertaining stories come from the projects that existed outside the normal product lineup. The B32 is one of those stories. It was not built to create a new category. It was built because Porsche needed a faster van. That practical beginning eventually produced something far more memorable. And maybe that is why modern enthusiasts find the B32 so appealing. Modern performance cars are obsessed with numbers. Horsepower. Torque. Acceleration. Nürburgring times. Top speed. The B32 had respectable numbers for its period, but the numbers are not really the reason anyone remembers it. People remember the concept. They remember the absurdity. They remember that somewhere in Porsche's history there was a factory-built Volkswagen Transporter with the engine of a 911. That single sentence is more memorable than almost any specification sheet. Because a great automotive story does not always begin with speed. Sometimes it begins with something that sounds impossible. A Porsche van. A 911 engine in the rear. Fuchs wheels. Better brakes. A hidden flat-six. And suddenly an ordinary transporter becomes one of the most unusual Porsche vehicles ever created. The B32 also represented a time when automotive manufacturers could build strange machines without needing to justify every detail to a global marketing strategy. Engineers could create a handful of vehicles because a specific project required them. Some would stay inside the company. Some would go to special customers. Some would eventually disappear. And a few would survive long enough to become legends. The B32 was one of those few. It may not have carried the visual drama of a 959 or the racing heritage of a 917, but it had something those cars could never have. Surprise! A 959 looks like it was designed to go fast. A 911 looks like it was designed to go fast. The B32 looks like it was designed to carry people and luggage. That is why its performance is so entertaining. Every kilometer per hour feels like it should not be happening. Every hard acceleration feels like someone accidentally installed the wrong engine. Every Porsche badge feels slightly mischievous. It is the automotive equivalent of a secret. And perhaps the strongest proof of the B32's uniqueness is that even today, decades after its creation, enthusiasts continue searching for genuine examples. The numbers are tiny, the surviving vehicles are valuable, and the story is almost impossible to reproduce. You can build a replica. You can install a 911 engine into a T3. You can fit Fuchs wheels and Porsche brakes. But you cannot recreate the fact that the original was built by Porsche in an era when the 911 and the 959 represented the company's engineering obsession. You cannot recreate the history of a factory car that was created to support Porsche's own work. And you certainly cannot recreate the mystery surrounding exactly how many were produced. That uncertainty has almost become part of the legend. Depending on the source, you will hear different numbers, but everyone agrees on the important fact: there were very few. Extremely few. And that makes the Porsche B32 more than just a strange old van. It makes it a snapshot of Porsche at a moment when engineering ambition could turn the most ordinary vehicle imaginable into something extraordinary. The B32 was never meant to become a cultural icon. It was not designed for collectors. It was not created to sell millions of cars. It simply had a job. Keep up. Carry people. Carry equipment. Carry parts. Do the work. And somehow, while doing that job, it became one of the most entertaining stories in Porsche history. That may be the greatest thing about it. The B32 did not start with a dream of building a supervan. It started with a boring problem. Porsche had vehicles that were fast. The support vans were not. So Porsche engineers replaced the problem with a 911 flat-six. And once they were finished, the result was something nobody could ignore. A Volkswagen Transporter that could approach 185 kilometers per hour. A Porsche that could carry a group of people. A rear-engine van with the heart of a Carrera. A vehicle built in tiny numbers that eventually became valuable enough to command hundreds of thousands of euros. And perhaps decades from now, people will remember the Porsche B32 for exactly what it was: proof that the most interesting cars are not always the ones that make the most sense. Sometimes they are the ones created because an engineer looked at an ordinary machine and simply refused to accept that it had to remain ordinary. Porsche could have kept the T3 slow. It could have accepted that support vehicles would arrive later. Instead, it built something completely unnecessary by normal standards. And that is why the B32 remains unforgettable. It was never supposed to be a Porsche in the traditional sense. It had sliding doors instead of scissor doors. A tall roof instead of a low silhouette. Passenger seats instead of a racing bucket. But underneath all of that was a 911 engine, Porsche hardware, Porsche engineering, and a very Porsche-like refusal to accept limitations. The B32 was not the fastest Porsche. It was not the most beautiful Porsche. It was not the most famous Porsche. But it may be one of the funniest and most brilliant examples of what happens when Porsche decides that even a van deserves to be fast. And maybe that is the perfect ending to its story. Because the next time you see an old Volkswagen T3 quietly moving down the highway, you might look at it a little differently. It could be carrying groceries. It could be carrying camping equipment. Or, in the rarest case imaginable, it could be carrying the soul of a Porsche 911. And somewhere behind the driver, an air-cooled flat-six could still be waiting for someone to press the accelerator.